So in my speech, I will be referring to Ceylon and Sri Lanka. The word Ceylon, especially for events that predated 1972, when this country became Sri Lanka. There are two factors we cannot ignore if we are to truly talk about Walter Stanley Senior. At first, the Reverend A.G. Fraser, whom Senior himself has compared to Rome's Augustus, who found Candy's Trinity in brick, in Senior's words, and left it pretty much in marble, who in a principalship of 20 years from 1904 to 1924 transformed this school to stand neck and shoulder with any other eminent educational institute in the country at the time, and who, pretty much on personal knowledge, invited W.S. Senior in 1905, at that time freshly out of Balliol, Oxford, and a classic scholar, to come down to Ceylon to be Trinity's vice principal. And secondly, the transformations that were going on in Ceylon at the time, in the 1910s and 1920s. Transformations both in the political front and more narrowly in the field of education. The transition from Ceylon League-style nationalism to one anchored on sectarian lines emerged and showed signs of being Lanka's future during Senior's time here. Between 1911 and 1931, a step at a time, Ceylon also moved along the path towards self-rule, a slow but sure-footed and forward-looking movement away from the 19th century colonialism. In all, this was an era of heightened democratic reform. All this while Senior came and saw Ceylon, where he had no purpose to conquer, but to serve with a heart and sense of duty, which, to his faith and call in life, rang true. Having arrived on these shores in 1906, until he returned to England in 1928, Senior gave 22 years of his life to Ceylon, with a growing fondness of its culture, ecology, folkways, people, and places. He held to admiration the glory of the country's past civilizations and took an interest in the country's faiths that fell outside his church. His poems speak endearingly to the country and also, and most importantly, to its posterity. In these poems, Senior has great hope for Ceylon's future. His poetical sketches and descriptions of valleys, hills, mountains, and remote places also makes the attentive reader familiar with a persona who took delight in travel and spiritual contentment in nature's bounty. To Senior, Ceylon was from first to last, and I'm quoting, the land of beauty, glamour, and kindness. When he passed over in February 1938, Senior was 61 years old. However, he maintained a close tie with Ceylon right till the end, visiting the country, what he lovingly called his foster mother, 2 years before his death. Senior's wish was to have his ashes flown down to and buried in Haputale, which held a dear place in his heart. The fondness he felt for the country, to which he, in his final condition, dissolved his mortal remains, which he served with his life's energy, is perhaps best reflected on the inscription carved in Haputale as Senior's epitaph, which reads, "Here I stand in spirit, as in body oft I stood, long years ago, in love with all the land, this peerless land of beauty's plenitude." While the study of W.S. Senior's poems has engaged some interest in the literary studies classroom in Sri Lanka, the absence of source and reference material in the public domain, the stuff that gives the critic good purchase of the subject, such as letters, diaries, memoirs, shreds of conversation, theatre tickets, selfies, These have, in my opinion, thoroughly disadvantaged the reader and the critic in her approach to Senior's writing. Other than Senior's collected poems in Vita Magistra, published in 1937 originally and republished twice then after, and Call of Lanka, Ceylon in Prose and Verse, published in 1960 by Trinity College, other than these two sources, very little is in circulation as primary source material for those interested in a study of Senior's writing. In Call of Lanka, Mrs. Senior produces a biographical sketch of Senior's life, which is descriptive as well as informative. To my knowledge, this biographical sketch is the only extensive and exhaustive document of its kind that is in circulation to benefit students and researchers. The absence of biography has proven detrimental over time, to say the least, as it made insubstantial readings for the absence of substance to be passed on as substance and conclusive knowledge. Therefore, in latter-day literature classrooms, as well as in scholarly essays, one comes across people who evaluate Senior without a close view of his heart, who present him as a soft-peddling colonialist, an ungrounded romanticist, and a clergyman who insisted on English tutelage, even at a time when Ceylon's nationalist movement crackled like a furnace. A close view of his heart being unavailable, the goodness of Senior's person, the love he shared with the men and women he met, and the inspiration he shared without agenda have not traveled to the scholarly reader. Dr. D.C.R. Gunatilaka, who in the 1980s and 1990s was the country's foremost authority in matters related to Sri Lankan English writing, is perhaps more appreciative of Senior's contribution to the country's literature than some others, but even his assessment of Senior as a writer and a subject is not entirely free of disapproval. Of Senior, Gunatilaka writes as follows, as recently as 2005. This is a quotation from Gunatilaka. Senior is a colonial in a well-meaning way. He sees British imperialism as tutelage, and although he thinks Ceylon's progress is slow, he looks ahead to independence and a commonwealth of nations. And he senses change in Ceylonese society during his own stay. His poetry is best summarized as good-bad poetry. Gunatilaka's immediate reference here, as I feel, is to a poem titled Tutelage, where Senior, contrary to the critic's assertion, is more interested in downsizing British occupation of Ceylon to yet another arrival in an island history of ceaseless such arrivals and instructions, after which those aliens, the arrivees, in the end depart. In a poem made of 5 quatrains and a couplet, 4 quatrains are dedicated to a study of the country's history of alien arrivals, consolidations, and departures, from which the country had learned and on which Sri Lanka's civilizations were built. It is in this light that Senior urges Ceylon to learn from Britain, the way of the modern world, but with the intention of redeeming her own sovereignty. Slow tutelage, the poem ends. Slow tutelage, now slow, but sure the goal. Lanka, have patience, thou shalt win thy soul. Senior's inspirational presence as a tutor and mentor is memorably recorded by Deva Suryasena, the musicologist, who became one of the pioneers in popularizing Lankan folk music on the world stage. Born as the son of Sir James Pearce to one of the leading Colombo families at the turn of the last century, Suryasena emerged as an important cultural phenomenon from the 1920s onwards. Between 1916 and 1919, as he prepared for Cambridge entrance examinations, Senior was assigned as Surya Sena's classics tutor. At this time, Surya Sena was still known as Herbert Charles Jacob Peris, the name he was given at birth. In his autobiography, Of Sri Lanka I Sing, Surya Sena remembers Senior's company with immense fondness. And this quotation is from Surya Sena. Coaching with him was a delightful experience. He would translate the Greek of Homer's Odyssey into English blank verse. He was musical too. In many young Ceylonese whom he taught at Trinity College, Kandy, he lit the spark of poetry and literature. I owe a great deal to Senior's influence and personality. He was a charming, lovable man. Senior was an Englishman who gave his heart to Ceylon. He picked out young men of talent, inspired, and encouraged them. On Senior's request, Surya Sena set to music the hymn for Ceylon, which we experienced earlier this evening, by adapting the score of a popular Sinhalese stage tune, Danno Budunge. Of Senior, sentiments quite in line with Surya Sena's assessment are also found in Canon R.S. de Seram's 1959 foreword to Call of Lanka, where he concedes as follows, quotation, "He loved Ceylon with all his heart. Foster mother, he calls her, and himself humbly child of an alien isle. Walter Stanley Senior was no alien. He had that quality of greatness which transcends both race and place." End of quote. Now, back to my point. There is an unassailable gap between the quote-unquote well-meaning colonial in Gunatilaka's assertion and quote-unquote the Englishman who to Ceylon gave his heart, as Surya Sena saw things, as well as in the man who, according to de Seram, quote-unquote, loved Ceylon with his heart. My considered deliberation is that the difference of view here is largely brought on by one's knowing little or less of the personal and the subjective side of Senior. The difference between learning Senior from inadequate sources and in knowing him intimately, and as in Surya Sena's case and that of de Seram's at first hand. It is this crucial knowledge gap that an autobiography of the kind we meet over today can serve to fill. My reading of the book of Reverend Walter Stanley Senior, which the principal was gracious enough to lend me, struck me for its candid, warm, and open nature, for its rich biographical detail, the considered conveyance of memory, and for the supporting information it provides a reader of Senior's poems. Some sections even read as if it was Senior's intention to supplement with explanation and annotation some of the popular poems he wrote. It is my estimate that this autobiography has the power to fine-tune, if not correct, and even transform the understanding of W.S. Senior's work in the field of literary studies, and how those poems are evaluated within the study space of Sri Lankan English writing, as well as in post-colonial writing. Perhaps the information we can glean from the autobiography will even add to a reader's assessment of a poem such as Goodbye, title of one of Senior's poems, a striking piece which Senior wrote as his time in Ceylon drew to a close. In any event, a poem which no ordinary colonialist or one who connived to yoke Ceylon to colonialism's millstone could have composed. The type of poem that only a foster son of a place to whose people he had given his heart could write upon repatriation. The poem Goodbye consists of two installments. The poem's opening movement draws our attention to a fast-changing Ceylon that was visibly growing hostile to foreign presences, a place that had no place for people like Senior. For the poet, a return home is now inevitable, even though he contemplates that prospect with very little enthusiasm. The northern England that comes through the poem is a grey and soggy place, with acres of mud and marsh and a lot of depressed imagery. Caught between these bitter dilemmas and unavoidable ground realities, the second movement of the poem brings Senior to the conclusion that goodbye, despite its being inevitable, is all the more impossible. And I beg your patience, I'm going to read that last installment. Yet, O my soul, remember, when you sail the seas away, and the English climate's chilly, and the English clouds are grey, when the birds are sad and silent, and the sun is seldom seen, and life is miles of houses with miles of mud between, you will see in a sudden vision, you will see with a sudden sigh, the scarlet splashed flamboyant afosh in the azure sky. You will see Anuradhapura and the old king's bathing pool, and the shadowy blue kingfisher on the carven granite pool, and the pass of Haputala, and the lowland flat and far, and through Granville feathers the rosy evening star, and the moon besilvered jungle, the dipping magic cross, amid steady balm in-blowing from the silver foam and floss. And better than places, faces, the Aryan face, your own, with its brown and olive beauty, the youths and maids you have known, and the tender pearl of India, in the black and brilliant eye, my soul. You will break with longing. It can never be goodbye. As I mentioned at the outset, for a rounded view of Senior's outlook and ethic, especially the time he spent in Kandy and at Trinity, one must also turn somewhat to a defining influence in Senior's life, Principal A.G. Fraser, and the intellectual culture of the circles Fraser and the like moved in Kandy at the time. There is very little doubt that Fraser had a mentoring role in young Senior's life. Picked by Fraser as he just came out of Oxford, Senior was only 30 years in age when he found himself as the vice principal of a dynamic school bent at the time on some progressive experiments. A revealing chapter on Trinity College is found in Ali Fuad Tulba's book Ceylon, the Land of Eternal Charm, which was published in 1925, where this son of Tulba Pasha, one of the Egyptian princes exiled to Ceylon after that country's revolution in 1879, who later studied at Kingswood in the 1890s and returned to Ceylon in 1921 on tour, Ali Fuad Tulba, who commends some of the great strides Trinity had made under Fraser's leadership. To Tulba, Fraser had, quotation, none of the stiff, priggish, pedantic, scowling type of headmaster, who, to the contrary, demonstrated, again quotation, a total absence of self-consciousness and self-assertiveness, end quote. Tulba applauds Fraser for acting with no color question, no shibboleths of race or creed. At the time, Fraser experimented by introducing to Trinity's curriculum aspects of local culture, such as the study of Sanskrit. The school at the time was open to progressive thinkers who, resonant of Fraser's own way of thinking, were hosted by the literary and historical associations. Names such as those of Andreas Nell and Elie Blase, the latter, who to Valeska Raymond was the main source in tracing Trinity's early history when Raymond wrote a history of Trinity College, Kandy in 1922. Nell and Blase were frequent speakers at these association meetings. Collectively, their ideas on topics such as vernacular education, the place of local culture in education, and the upkeep of general education were parallel to those of Reverend Fraser. Blase, for example, called for Sinhala medium school instruction as early as 1906, and as early as 1911, he wrote in favor of a Ceylonese university with degrees in subjects designed to sustain local interests. The ambience of this progressive environment couldn't have missed its mark on young Senior, whose worldview and sense of service could only have been sharpened by its rays. In concluding, as an academic who dedicates reasonable time for the study of Sri Lankan literature, I can assure that no person in this renowned assembly today is more thrilled than I am at the publication of this autobiography. Since I teach a compendium of Sri Lankan literature of the pre-independence period, which includes W.S. Senior's poetry at Sri Jayawardhanapura University in Nugegoda, I'm quite aware of the grievance of resource scarcity that cuts into our scholarly enthusiasm in a big way. The patrons of this publication, therefore, have done immeasurable service and contribution to the field which we wholeheartedly appraise. In concluding, also, I wish to acknowledge two leading academics in the field of literary studies in Sri Lanka, whose conversations, measured ideas, and scholarly guidance have played a role in my grooming as a researcher, and whose direction first led me to W.S. Senior's writing when I was a student at Peradeniya half a lifetime ago. Walter Perera, Emeritus Professor, University of Peradeniya, and Dr. Nihal Fernando, unarguably one of the sharpest minds the country's English Academy has had the fortune of having over the past 4 decades. Their conversation continues to enrich my literary interest of W.S. Senior's era, and there is no fitter place than at Trinity to make this acknowledgement, where both Fernando and Perera studied as boys. To speak to you on this important occasion at this historical venue gave me much happiness for having me over and for welcoming me among you, to the principal and to the school, as well as to the Trinity community in the broader sense. I extend my sincere thanks. Thank you.